Hey guys, we're going to take a few minutes to finish up the notes from Friday, so if you could pause me for a second to get them out, either the notes packet that you had printed or upload your notes from wherever you have them saved. So there are three basic things we're going to talk about today. First is the structure of a mission in the Camino Real. This is basically a recap from last class. You just had to spend time preparing for what goes on in a mission, but we never took time to actually talk about what one looks like. So that's what I'm going to do today. The two big things we're going to talk about that are new are what threatened Spain's control over Texas and how did those threats affect Texas. Both of those things will help us to better transition into Chapter 8. So this is a typical plan for a Spanish mission. Most people think, whenever they think of a mission in Texas, if they have thought of it at all, is to think about the Alamo. Now, the Alamo is an example of a part of a mission, but it is not the mission itself. It is actually only one small part. This building, the one that we all kind of think of, is actually just the church. And the church itself was actually not complete. What we see today is what we've completed after the famous Battle of the Alamo. So the basic structure of a mission is that it's supposed to look like a little town. If you were ever in need of closing up all of the gates, it's supposed to be able to function so that you can protect yourself and still provide for your basic needs for a short amount of time. So some things that are going on around the mission. Usually they are built along rivers. This particular one, and it's just a sample, shows the San Antonio River. So it's like one of the 5 San Antonio missions. The mission itself has a fortified wall all the way around. Some parts of the wall contain apartments, like this, and these would probably be divided up later. Those are where the Native Americans would live. So it was a very European style of living. You would have a front door. Sometimes the apartments would connect and you'd have 2 rooms. Sometimes you just have one. It depends on the situation. Sometimes you wouldn't have apartments at all. You would just have a wall that was either made out of stone or wood. Usually these walls are in an area where they don't expect a lot of people to attack, because it's hard to, there must be something going on at the river north of this, for example, because I think it would be hard to attack and you probably wouldn't have to have, a really big fortification there. The walls along the Native American housing were generally about 3 feet thick, so if you would, for example, have to sustain a cannon blast, it would be very hard to knock it down. So these were just very, very sturdy walls. Other things that you see here is that there are gates on the north, south, east, and west side. These are for people to go in and out of the mission. Most of the time you would have your majority of your farming land and your ranching going on outside of the mission. So the Native Americans didn't spend their day inside of the mission walls all of the time. You'd also have bigger gates, like this fortified west gate here, where you would have major shipments coming in and out of the mission. So most of the missions were close to the Camino Real, which we'll talk about in a second, and they had supplies coming at random intervals. You also had fortified bastions, which are basically little military fort-like things where you could shoot from and have a good vantage point on the corners. So if the soldiers were holding up in the mission, they could use it as a fort as well. Now, you would also have churches. So you would have a temporary church that was built when the mission was first getting going. But then you would have the church as we see it. The typical shape is to have the main part of the nave and then 2 side chapels to make it kind of look like a cross. This is where if this was the Alamo, this is kind of where it would have been located. So the church for the missions, with most pictures that you see of missions, is this one, not the original one. Now, most of the missions were not completed to this large of a scale. In theory, you wanted to have a granary where you could keep all of your excess grain or other crops that you grew. You would have some kind of a convent where monks or nuns could come and live. You would have a localized garden where, things were easily gotten, but it wasn't meant to fill everyone's stomachs all the time. That's what your major farming land outside of the mission was for. And you'd also have places to just kind of contemplate and reflect on religious matters. There'd also be things like schools and other classrooms going on in this location as well. And yes, you did have a cemetery. They buried people here at first because when the mission was first built, it did not have the outside wall. So the church that was first built, this was like the main room, the multi-purpose room of the mission when it was first starting, it made sense to bury the people next to the church. And then as time grew and the mission grew, they find another place. So this is a map that shows some of the major missions across Texas. There were 5 in San Antonio, but there were more scattered out all over the place. If you notice, most of them are along rivers because you need a source of fresh water for farming. And a lot of them do have presidios. So the little X marks are presidios. Now, they were nearby. They weren't necessarily right next to the missions. So the soldiers there would have to travel a lot and travel from mission to mission to do their job. The Camino Real was set up by the Spanish to basically connect and resupply all of the missions and presidios across Texas. The original road is in black here, and it went from Mexico all the way to Nacogdoches, which is where the last Texas mission was located. Eventually it did go into Natchitoches, Louisiana, because Spain at one time did own Louisiana, and they wanted it to go all the way through to the edge of their territory. But later on, we're going to talk about them losing Louisiana. Nacogdoches was kind of the last stopping point in Texas. All of the other roads came up later as they were needed or as other missions came about and they had to connect them in some way. So, how does Spain keep control of its territory? So, Spain basically had some issues controlling Texas. Texas had a lot of Native Americans that lived in it. It was very frontier, which means there is no help if you ever need it. You're living a lifestyle that basically your family is supposed to just take care of themselves. You cannot count on Spanish soldiers or the Spanish government to help you out. Unfortunately, the United States starts to grow at this time. In 1775, we start our fight for independence, and the original 13 colonies, which were basically along the edge of this orange here, start to work together to defeat Great Britain, and in 1783, they officially gain their independence. Now, as soon as they gained their independence, they started to go over the Appalachian Mountains, which are located over here. Britain had a rule that said that they couldn't live past that because they couldn't protect them. But once we won our independence, people started hopping over and started occupying these other territories. So currently it shows the state boundaries on this map. A lot of them would just be these blobs of territory that had some people in it. The government knew that it was there, but a territory is not a state yet because there's not enough people. Unfortunately, some of the settlers started to cross the Mississippi, which was a problem. This was a problem because, just like in Texas, Spain didn't have any control of this area called Louisiana. It had very few soldiers roaming around in it, and it couldn't keep the U.S. settlers from settling. The U.S. settlers moved in and basically were squatting, which means settling without permission, in the Louisiana territory. Now, Spain allowed it because they simply needed more people to live there. One of the problems was that Native Americans were still causing a lot of issues, and they figured, well, if the people in the United States were willing to live on the frontier, maybe they can help us keep things under control. Unfortunately, however, because of the way the war panned out, France ended up forcing Spain to sell Louisiana territory to the United States. Now, I'm not going to go into details about why that happened right now, though you'll go into more detail on that next year. But for right now, you just need to know Spain sold this area to the United States. Now, this was a huge deal. The United States basically doubled in size. Everything that's over here in the blue and the orange was before the Louisiana Purchase, and then they also acquired the green and this little bit of blue. Now, the other problem was not just that the United States was getting big, but that the United States disagreed on where the border was. This map shows Louisiana Purchase, you know, with this black line here. But a lot of people in the United States said that no, Rio Grande was the border of Texas, so that's also included in Louisiana Purchase. So there was a lot of going back and forth going on, and nobody could really agree, and Spain was like, no, we need to get this figured out. We're tired of people moving in and having everything be really fuzzy. So then they created the Adams-Onis Treaty. So in a nutshell, the Adams-Onis Treaty officially set the Texas-United States border at the Sabine River, which is Texas's current border with Louisiana today. It went up the Red River and then just kept going this way. So New Spain was now in this area. The United States was now in everything that is pink. In addition to this deal, Spain also gave up Florida. So the United States also gained Florida. Again, there were people living there. Spain had trouble keeping people out. So they were just like, we can't control it. You have that. We'll move the border to here. They felt that it was even. So Spain gave up this territory, and the United States, if they thought it was the Rio Grande, they felt giving up this much was a fair deal because they were getting Florida instead. Other issues were people called filibusters. So a filibuster, when you hear about it in the news today, you probably think about Congress. So this is Texas Senator Wendy Davis. In the last year, she filibustered in the Texas Senate to try to not get a bill passed. Now, this is not the definition of a filibuster for the time period we're talking about. A filibuster is actually a military adventurer who goes into a foreign country to encourage rebellion. So there were 3 different types of filibusters, but all of them were an equal amount of headache for Spain. So some of them wanted to actually free the Texas territory to have it join the United States. They did not agree with the Adams-Onis Treaty. They thought that Texas should have been part of the United States because there were people already living there that were from the U.S. And, you know, they just had this, well, we're moving westward, Spain needs to get out of the way kind of attitude. The second group of people wanted to encourage Mexico to get free from Spain. So, as you saw, or as you know, with the United States was controlled by the King of Britain. The King of Britain never set foot on American soil, but he was having laws to people that he was controlling, but he had never met. The same thing was going on in Mexico, because it was part of New Spain. So, since the United States won its revolution, they thought that Mexico should have one of its own, and they were going around encouraging that. And lastly, you just had people that were going in for adventure and wealth. The filibusters would go in, they'd demand control of whatever area they were in, they'd get the support of the people, and they would just kind of say, nope, I'm in control, not the Spanish governor. So essentially, no matter what kind of filibuster you are causing some kind of headache for the Spanish government. Now, New Spain actually had its own set of issues, and this one was much more pressing than the filibusters were at all. So Mexico actually wanted its independence. There was a widespread economic and social divisions between the rich and the poor. Basically, your viceroys and everybody that they appointed were very, very rich. But everyone else was very poor and never really had a way to move forward because the government would just make new taxes to force them to be very poor. There was also political corruption. Obviously, for the same thing, if you force a certain amount of people to be rich and everyone else to be poor, you're not serving the purpose a government is supposed to serve, which is to take care of the people. And finally, Mexico had seen other revolutions work. People read the newspapers. They heard about revolts in Latin America to get rid of some of the other European control. They heard of some revolts in the Caribbean islands. They heard of the United States getting its freedom from Great Britain. All of those gave them the confidence to feel that they could overthrow their government. And in 1822, they did. Agustin Iturbide and Vicente Guerrero were both major military people, and they helped to overthrow the Spanish government. Iturbide declared himself Emperor of Mexico and established Mexico as a republic. So now is where we officially get the country of Mexico as we know it today. So what does this mean for Texas? So first, the Tejanos that had been fighting or had been living in Texas had either been killed or decided that Texas was not for them. The war had caused them to be relocated, and when they went back home, they basically had to start over. So a lot of the people in Texas relocated to deeper parts of Mexico so that they could start over just because it was easier and it was not out on the frontier. Relations with the natives were also strained. The war had caused many Tejanos to either leave and their families were at risk, or it had caused people to make a last-ditch effort with the missions. Basically, the natives didn't take to that very well. It started attacking Anglo settlements. Since there were no soldiers hardly in Texas at the moment, it caused some real issues. The economy was also devastated. People had left, livestock and crops were left untended, and they basically had to start over when they came back to Texas. And finally, the missions had failed. The natives didn't like living there. They did not like Catholicism. The Spanish government tried to offer free land in northern Texas to get people to come in, but the settlers just did not want to take the risk. So now the Mexican government is sitting there going, what am I supposed to do now? But they had a plan. They wanted to get people in. They needed to make sure those people were safe and that they would follow a certain set of rules, and they needed to make sure that the U.S. government was staying out of it. So all of this was answered with Let Outsiders Colonize Texas, and Chapter 8 will take us into the rules and regulations that went along with that.